Hidden Conversations is coordinated by WVIK and hosted by Dr. LaDrina Wilson, a leadership and diversity expert and founder of IMAN Consulting. These conversations are designed to delve into many of the most difficult issues of race and equity facing the Quad Cities today. Many of these issues we hear about every day on the national news, but then are left unaware when they occur to our own friends and neighbors. We hope that by hearing firsthand stories and statistics from experts based right here in the Quad Cities, we can break down the myth that these things only happen somewhere else, and in so doing, increase our empathy for those who literally live right next door. Thank you for joining us this evening. Here's Dr. LaDrina Wilson.
Good evening. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to come together with you all yet again for another hidden conversation. I think the conversations that we've been having over the last, I guess we're over a year now, have been really important to delving into some of the unique experiences of people of color. Tonight's conversation is a little bit different. It's going to hit home differently for some people that have been directly impacted by experiencing the disappearance of a loved one. But certainly it touches on things at the local level, but also at the national level and in between. And so tonight we're going to situate the conversation both at the local level, but also look at what's happening in terms of a national phenomenon. This evening, we're talking about missing persons, and we're talking about the disparate coverage in coverage of missing people, particularly people of color. We know that the Gabby Petito case has been front and center in media for the past several weeks now. We know that we've just reached another point in the investigation where I believe they've identified the remains of their primary suspect, Gabby Petito's boyfriend. And in the course of these last several weeks, we've heard lots of conversations around what has been coined as missing white woman syndrome and why are certain stories told and others aren't. And so tonight we're going to delve into that more specifically, looking at it from a law enforcement perspective, looking at it from a media perspective, and then looking at it from the perspective of those individuals who are personally impacted by having a loved one that's been indicated as missing. With that, I want to share just a little bit with you all about my family's background. I have a cousin, I guess it would be second or third cousins, but to be quite honest with you, and in my community, we don't count cousins. You're just a cousin. In fact, if you're a close friend, you're a cousin. So, but in this particular situation is my father's first cousin. Her name was Regina McCorkle, and she's been missing now for 41 years. And being that it was my father's cousin and that she was never found or hasn't been found, it deeply shaped his parenting and how he assessed threats. I can recall situations where if I didn't come home at a certain time, I got a lecture that included, "My cousin Regina has been missing." If I didn't beat the streetlights home, and for those of you who know, that was the gauge of when you had to be home. It wasn't a time, it was whether or not the street lights had come on. When I was a really small child, probably 6 or 7 years old, playing in the neighborhood, I can distinctively remember him describing to me the disappearance of his cousin and how she's never been found. So this shapes people's lives and how they assess threats in a different way than maybe other experiences do. And so there's this lingering fear when you don't have that closure in the unknown and you don't know what happened to your loved one. But what's more alarming to me as I think about my cousin Regina, and I can't tell you the number of times that my father called me Regina instead of LaDrina, if that's an indicator of how close they were. But what's alarming to me is that she's one story, but there are so many families, particularly Black families, that have a story like this. You see, according to the National Crime Info Center, in 2020, there were over 185,000 reported cases of individuals who were Blacks who were reported missing. And that comprises about 34% of all missing cases reported in that year. However, the Black population only makes up about 13% of our national makeup in terms of ethnicity and race. So you can see the disproportionality in our experience as Black Americans in our likelihood or propensity to potentially end up missing. Yet in media coverage, we don't see that. And so tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about what impact we can have at the local level to overcome that. How do we end up in this place, and what needs to happen moving forward? So with that, I'm going to bring in our guests for this evening, who have personal experience and knowledge that they bring to this conversation that is far more detailed and intricate than I can bring to the conversation. Certainly recognizing that my father's story, my family's story, is some 40 plus years old, making my cousin one of the longest standing missing person cases here in the Quad Cities, I believe, for the city of Moline, if I'm not mistaken. So with that, I want to briefly introduce Sharmaine Harris, who's a police officer here in our community. We have Mr. Bryon Tyson, who is a longtime resident of the Quad Cities, who is now moved away from us for warmer weather, and I can't blame him there. But certainly he has experience in this area, and he'll share his background and his connection to missing persons as we continue the conversation. And we have Renata Sago, a renowned journalist who has worked both here at the local level and clearly at the national and international level with some of her works that are published and printed. So with that, I'd love to just jump right in. Thank you all for joining us for this very important conversation. And I just want you to know that I recognize each of you are uniquely situated in this conversation, making you an expert, and not only in your experience, but in how you will inform our audience and our listeners of what is happening behind the scenes when we are only getting the media coverage. So with that, I guess I'll start off probably maybe if we could start with you, Mr. Tyson, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what brings you to this conversation, and then we'll jump into the other panelists.
Yes, I'm Bryon Tyson. I've lived in the Quad Cities for roughly a little over 33, 34 years. I've raised two kids while living there. I have a son and a daughter. My wife and I have just recently moved down to Florida for a little warmer climate and just to relax. But I retired I'm a finance manager. I retired from John Deere. We've owned and operated a restaurant in Rock Island for about 12 years. And where my kids were highly involved in that operation, particularly my daughter Benji. My daughter Benji, for the last 11 years, has been missing, and it's been a rather disappointing experience in that we haven't heard. No one has heard from her in the last 11 years. She has a son who's now 21 years old, and he hasn't seen her since he was probably 6 or 7 years old. When we first realized she was missing, we started putting out feelers. She had been traveling with a friend of hers across out in the West. She was living in Arizona, and she had a boyfriend, and they had been traveling around throughout the West, from Arizona to Nevada to wound up in Red Lodge, Montana. And the last time we talked to her was on Thanksgiving Day about 11 years ago, and we haven't heard from her since. They traveled a lot, and she made a point of letting us know about where she was, in that year before she left. And after that phone call on Thanksgiving, we didn't hear from her, and a month passed by, and so I started making some phone calls, and we began to get worried. And finally, we realized that something may have happened to her, because she was in a volatile relationship with that guy. And so what we tried to do is we tried calling some authorities in Montana, and they put I think it was assigned to a detective who may or may not have had a lot of interest in it. She was 30 at the time. She was 33 years old, and she's a grown woman, and she can make her decisions on her own. And I think they kind of just they okay, well, we'll take a look. They took a nonchalant attitude about it. So after that, we put her on the national missing persons list. I posted a picture of her out on Facebook and called the local authorities at Red Lodge. We also put her on the FBI National Crime Information Center and the Montana Criminal Justice Information Network for Missing Persons. And really, that's the extent of it. I had a detective looking at it. I sent a lot of information to the detective about who she was traveling with, and last time we talked to her, but it just never seemed to generate any favorable information to let us know where she was.
Mm-hmm.
And
Was
up to this day, we just don't know.
Was there coverage at the local level, like in Montana? Or did the local media here in the Quad Cities pick it up with her being a Quad City native? Or
There was nothing in the local media about it at all, since she wasn't living there anymore. So we put feelers out in Arizona, and it was primarily in Montana. But I don't know. I don't live in Montana, so I don't know what kind of local coverage it may have had. I don't suspect it made the local news.
Yeah. I would imagine at some point, if it had, some reporter or someone would have reached out to the loved ones who were actively searching, right? I would think, but perhaps that's maybe not a fair assumption.
Oddly enough, the most interest it got was probably on Facebook. She had a lot of friends on Facebook. She was out there quite a bit, and when she never commented anymore. Nobody was hearing from her anymore, and I got the most attention through Facebook. But that didn't, we had a few leads from that, but they were investigated, and nothing ever turned up from that.
Well, I just want you to know, I know that this probably is not easy in terms of sharing your story, but hopefully through people listening, hopefully it can generate some additional information or interest so that people maybe are able to, re-engage if they find it appropriate. And so I just want to thank you. I want to hold space for you and your family because I recognize this is not an easy conversation to have, but it's an important one. And so thank you for allowing us to glean from your experience to better understand what's happening behind the scenes. So you did indicate that there was a detective that you were paired with and that they began an investigation. We have a police officer here on the line with us who maybe can give us some insights into kind of what happens once they come in contact with a family who indicates they have a missing person. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sharmaine, for you to kind of give us some insight on what your experiences are as it relates to missing persons, understanding that it's not connected to Mr. Tyson's story specifically, but just in general, what does that process look like?
Thank you. So I just first want to express, Mr. Tyson, my empathy for you. I mean, I can't imagine the sadness that you feel. I mean, experiencing something like that, something I've never experienced personally, but I worked investigations for probably 4 years now, specifically juvenile investigations. So any call involving a juvenile, whether it's a missing person, a child homicide, a sex assault, a child abuse, those are all cases that are assigned directly to me. So in an instance, just like yesterday, actually, where we got a child 3 years old, they're missing. We're running out the door immediately, and that's going to be almost everybody that's available at the police department. So I'm not really sure what your experiences was. Doesn't sound like it was very fair. But for us, it's an immediate, everyone's out there, we're searching, we're gathering information, and we are doing everything we can to find this person. And then that broadcast goes out to other local agencies, and then it gets to the point to where we're doing like an Amber Alert for national agencies to start looking for this child. I know can I ask, I don't know if I missed that. How old was your daughter?
33 at the time.
33 at the time. Okay. So, in a lot of instances, I think from my experiences, children seem to get more attention when they're missing than adults. That's just naturally how it goes. But for us, if someone's missing, child or adult, in that we've exhausted all of our options at that time, which is, social media, neighbors, we're canvassing neighborhoods, we're searching houses. In your case, we would be, looking up financial records, all kinds of different things to help us find this person, right? So we've been exhausted all that. It's kind of sad to say, but it's kind of like now we're requesting information for people to come to us, and try to give us information. So I guess when we first get it, something serious like that, when we know that this missing person is going to turn into an extended search, now our captains and our chiefs are working directly with the media to try to figure out what we need to do. In terms of now we need the help from the public to figure out where this person is. That makes sense.
Yeah. So one thing that you said there, Sharmaine, that was kind of interesting to me is you said that children typically get more coverage than adults. And so I'm not speaking on behalf of you, but let me help you understand my interpretation. And certainly any of you that have a different interpretation, I invite you to jump right in. From my perception, the media in a way dictates who needs saving. So
I would agree.
Okay. So we know that, children are worthy of saving.
Yes.
Right. Adults can disappear themselves, right? Like they can choose to walk away. So I recognize that there's a difference in in how that's interpreted. But let's extend that example a little bit further. When we see this disparate coverage, and we see that particularly women, right? Because women tend to get covered more as well. There's a message about who needs saving. And so I guess the frustrating part for me in this, and this is not about law enforcement specifically, but the frustrating part for me is essentially when you decide who needs saving, you're also saying who's not worth saving.
Yes.
And so I see us rushing to save white women from a media perspective. And if the efforts that you're describing in the order in which you're describing them happen for everybody, why is it that the attention gets placed more specifically on white women?
So I can't answer that because from a law enforcement standpoint,
I think Renata's trying to jump in. She's like, I can.
So I can't answer that because our investigations we follow the same policy and procedure for anybody that's missing, right? So when there's a missing person and we notify the media, we send out a press release. It is now up to them to portray it how they wish to. But our efforts are the same as far as from an investigative standpoint.
Okay.
So I can't answer that.
So then, Renata, this might be
right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so appreciative to be a part of this conversation. And I just hope that we can continue to spread awareness about all the women who have gone missing, including your daughter, Mr. Tyson. So when you're in a newsroom, your first interaction with a missing person, the knowledge of that person that is being missing is through a press release. So you get an email, and it may be from your news director. It may be directly from the police station, and it says this person has gone missing. There's a pitch for engagement, and based on your role in the newsroom, you're going to get an assignment to go out and cover that, which may be a press conference where the family is there. I will say that I want to bring up some statistics since we're talking about white women and this white women syndrome that Gwen Ifill coined. We have to really assess the makeup of newsrooms if we're going to talk about media. I think there's this blanket statement about media when the media is very nuanced nowadays. So when we talk about traditional mainstream media, we're talking the big outlets, TV stations, the CNNs, the NBCs, the Foxes, all the way down to their affiliate stations across the country. We have a lot of leadership that is really white. That's the thing, is white. We have white editors, we have white news directors, we have white general managers. And there is no problem with that unless there's a disconnect between the white leadership and the rest of the community. So I want to read off some statistics. Last year, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism released findings from an analysis of 100 major online and offline news outlets in 5 different markets across the world. This isn't just local or national, this is global. So we're talking Brazil, Germany, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And in their analysis, they found that not one of the outlets in Germany and the United Kingdom had a non-white editor. In Brazil, just one white top editor. In the US, only 2 editors who are not white. In South Africa, they had the majority, but that's a country that's dealt greatly with its own racial history. So all that to say, when we're talking about coverage, we have to look at who determines what stories are important. And the people who are doing that, they naturally will be guided to tell stories of their own communities or likeness.
Yeah, as you say that, Renata, how does a situation like the Gabby Petito's case, how does it get such national attention? What's unique about their situation that's not unique to any other missing person's situation? How does it get to the national level?
It's a really good question. And I think a lot of people are asking themselves that. Sometimes it's a question of power. And when we talk about power, this means somebody knows somebody. And sometimes it's just perhaps a missing person is a poster child for what this country might look like or might want to perpetuate in this identity of what it looks like or what it thinks it should look like. And so that's where we have these stories of white women, maybe upper middle class white women, who get the coverage.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's necessarily that fits the case for her, that particular situation. It doesn't look like either one was, very well off. I don't know if there's money involved, but
so one of the, I'm sorry, go ahead, Renata.
No, and that's where we have to, I bring up this word power, and that changes, it changes. And so when we think about who is watching certain television outlets, advertisers as well, who they're looking to appeal to, when we think about political power, it just gets real interesting about who stations, particularly commercially funded stations, might want to appeal to.
Yeah. I think, go ahead, Sharmaine.
No, you go ahead.
So I think there's
often,
okay, there's often this perception that power equals money, right? So I think sometimes the right word, and not to imply that your word choice was wrong, but another word for us to put in there is privilege. Yes. And so I want to situate the conversation there for just a moment, because while they may not have come from financial means, as far as what I can tell, there is this standard of beauty. This is this petite,
22-year-old.
22-year-old. I can't think of a cuter age. That's like when I feel like my best year, right? It's cute, like you're at the prime of your life. We romanticize all this lost potential. She had a strong social media presence, right? And that's even like this filter that's kind of romanticized what her life was happening. Because if you go and you look at her page, or you look at her partner's page, they appeared to be living this wanderlust, carefree life with so much potential. And we all know that that's not a true representation of like what life is, period, what people put on social media. But then also, the media has now continued to kind of like perpetuate that, right? And instead of focusing on things that could have been focused on, like all the other missing people, domestic violence, that's associated oftentimes with missing persons, there's some power that's or privilege that's dictating who's valuable, right? And who's worth covering, and who's got lost potential. If you got kids or adults who are coming from low-income families and crime-ridden neighborhoods, who says that's a loss? Right?
Yeah, I want to re-invite us, and I love that we're exploring power and privilege. I really want to re-invite us to reframe this word media and lumping all media together, because we are in such an age of information that a lot of times you have citizen journalists, you have people operating within public newsrooms or public media spaces who are helping push the envelope and push out these narratives through various outlets. We're talking social media, and a lot of times mainstream media outlets may look to or have to look to social media, the Twitters, the Facebooks, in order to inform storytelling. So, I mean, I know that the idea is to be able to have an important story of a missing loved one elevated to a platform that's going to reach a lot of views and get a lot of attention. But there are so many other outlets also working diligently to tell these stories. Unfortunately, are they getting the funding that they should be getting? Do they have the manpower that they should have? Sometimes they don't. And that cripples us as well.
Right. Thank you for that reminder to not use this blanket phrase, because, it's easy to do when you're not in that space. And so I appreciate that. Sharmaine, you were going to jump in for a moment.
I think you guys pretty much covered it as far as power and privilege goes. I was going to jump in on that, but I think you covered it pretty well.
Well, and you mentioned power and privilege, and there's been a lot of discussion over the past few years about systemic racism, and I'm just throwing it out there. What kind of impact do you think that systemic racism plays on this type of situation?
I think systemic racism. I think everything plays, every aspect of our life. Especially every aspect of our life. There's systemic racism, because when I make notification to the media, hey, this person is missing, I don't know what that person's perspective is. I don't know how valuable they see this citizen and how they're going to portray the information that they have out into the media, how important they think it is. That's all goes back to power and privilege. Circles back around to that. I'm not sure, because when I go to work, just because I'm compassionate about something or about everything that I do, doesn't mean that when that notification is passed on to the media or to a different agency who's helping me with this case, doesn't mean that they feel that they'll put forth that same effort.
I think there's a lot of pressure to, when we think about systemic racism, as you say, is everywhere. It's within law enforcement, it's within newsrooms, and law enforcement and newsrooms, they have this symbiotic relationship. Like, we rely upon each other. You know, like law enforcement needs the newsrooms to get the word out about, you know, new policies or missing women like Mr. Tyson's daughter. But then at the same time, we see so many cases where law enforcement doesn't really have the accountability that it needs. And you need the newsroom to hold the law enforcement accountable. And so it becomes this pressurized situation where you just, I mean, I was just reading, you know, in preparation for this conversation about some people who have just been so fed up with both newsrooms and law enforcement, and they've launched investigations of their own. Like they're using apps, you know, really mobilizing within the community. And that's a lot of pressure emotionally when you're dealing with the loss of a loved one to have to do that.
Can I ask you, Mr. Tyson, how closely were you involved, or did you work with the law enforcement and the media in regards to your daughter's disappearance?
We were very closely involved. It was long distance. It was in Montana, but we shared with them her whole situation, particularly with the guy that she was traveling with. They had a very volatile relationship, and we were worried that we did have some concern that there's something could happen to her. And we believe to this day that the guy she was traveling with knows what happened to her. And
do they know where he is too? Do they know where he is as well?
We know where he is right now. We even know where he is right now.
We're both missing.
Wow.
No,
Wow.
just her. And you know, he had a very unsavory background, being in and out of jail, and you know, we think he knows what happened to her. And you know, you can speculate all you want as far. I mean, he said the last time he saw her was at a truck stop. He took her. They had an argument. She got out at a truck stop, and no one's seen her since. So we think he knows something. And you know, it's been 11 years, and we still can't nail it down to say that he did something to her, or that he had somebody take care of her. Now, I hate to speculate. I hate to think of what could have happened to her. And I just hope, we still hope and pray that she's safe somewhere, that God is watching over her somewhere. And I don't want to think the worst, but as the years go by, you know, it wears thin on you, and you gotta think of the worst at times. And my wife hates to think that way, but you know, I'm just trying to keep it real. That something, I just don't know. I hope and pray she's still alive.
So, LaDrina, I believe you asked this already. Mr. Tyson, you said that there was no local or national news in reference to your daughter's disappearance.
Well, there was no local news in the Quad Cities because she didn't live in the Quad Cities. It probably didn't make a whole lot of sense to publicize it there. I can only hope that there was.
So can I put a pin there for just a moment, because we hear stories about people who, if there was a natural disaster in Florida, if right now you guys got rocked by a hurricane, sometimes we have local reporters that will get on the horn and find somebody from the Quad Cities to tell that story. So I struggle with the fact that, I just struggle a little bit with that idea that maybe it wasn't relevant. A lot of the people she knew who would be interested in finding her are here, right? I would think.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So what were your efforts as far as persuading or convincing the local agencies and the local media there in Montana to put that out? Or did you ever go to media here in the Quad Cities to get more coverage?
Well, we have used our contacts here. We knew a lot of judges. We knew some people in law enforcement, and we had some people in the Quad Cities make phone calls to the people out in Nevada or Montana to to see what they could find and see what they could drum up in terms of information about maybe where her whereabouts were. I mean, we there was a guy in Chicago we got involved at one point, and it really, all of those efforts hit dead ends, and so we're still in the situation we're in right now. There's been no
So,
information.
so
You
one
had access to a lot of people with clout.
power.
Yeah, we we don't have a lot of clout, but we knew some connections, and we had people who tried to look into it, but she's still missing.
So one thing that I heard you say earlier, Mr. Tyson, was around where you got the most kind of input or feedback or opportunity was on social media. And so I guess I'm curious from considering that experience, and then also looking at Sharmaine, the work that you do, and Renata, the work that you do, how does social media influence an investigation? Is it disruptive, and does it create well, let me just leave it at that. I don't want to lead you. How does social media influence a missing person investigation, Sharmaine? And then I guess, Renata, I'd also like to hear from you. How does what people are posting influence, the media reporting?
I think it has a huge influence on it because, I mean, we're in the generation now to where, I mean, social media is very relevant. So immediately, if I'm going to get a case where there's a missing person or any serious investigation or any investigation for that matter, I'm going directly to social media because I have to take into consideration every lead possible as to help me with the investigation. So most of the time, I'm going to put in a preservation request to that, whether it's Facebook, Snapchat, whatever. So I find something, so I get a missing child report today. Now I need to do a preservation letter for any involved parties because I'm going to be writing a search warrant for all these people's accounts, what they've been communicating.
What's a preservation letter?
And so a preservation request is, so let's say I get today you have so in your instance, Mr. Tyson, your daughter is missing. The gentleman she was with is a person of interest. So I'm going to be sending Facebook a letter to say, hey, I need you to preserve all records from this time frame so that he can't go back and delete conversations and delete potential evidence. So he can try to delete it, but on the back end, internally, all that data is preserved so that I can use that later. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just need I was assuming that's not always the right thing to do, but I also know if somebody's listening, they might be trying to assume too. So
yeah, so I mean, social media is just huge for us now because we get a lot of information from social media. So that preservation letter goes out, I'm getting everything back that people think that they've deleted or that's permanently removed, and it's going to assist me in my investigation.
And when you say it assists you in the investigation, do you ever end up in situations where, because you have to react to this multitude of people who maybe have thoughts, opinions, speculations, and quite frankly, just get on there and lie, right? Mm-hmm. We know that happens. Does it detract from legitimate aspects of the investigation?
It can. It can. I think every case is different. Every case is different, so it just depends.
Okay. Renata, in your experience, I feel a little, first of all, let me back up for a second. I'm happy to call any of you by your last name. I just call Mr. Tyson because I've known him since I was about 13 or 14 years old. So he's always going to be Mr. Tyson, even when he gives me permission to not call him that. So I just want to make sure I have equal amount of respect for you. It's just a formality, for me.
I've been called a lot worse, so you're fine.
So in terms of how, not necessarily mainstream media, but like at a reporter level even, how do you react and respond to what's happening on social media as it informs your work in publishing and writing?
Yeah, I just want to say I have never done the deep investigation of finding or trying to find a missing person within a newsroom. Now, I've had some family situations where I used my investigative skills to try to figure out, where somebody was. But to answer your question, social media is extremely helpful, because what it does is, well, it complicates things, but it's helpful to some extent. When we talk about the benefits of social media, it creates this pressure, almost this balance of the fourth estate and then law enforcement. So you have people who are able to, they have a platform. Gone are the days where you have to, I don't know, send a telegram or to a news outlet and just hope that your story get covered. No, you can launch your own campaign on social media. Now, we could talk about metrics, we could talk about censorship, we could talk about advertising dollars and the very visibility of what you might put on there, if it will get any visibility, because there are algorithms now that affect just what we get to see. But in terms of shaping my reporting, it's been critical for finding sources, for being able to have access to voices that you just may not have access to through the traditional route. At the same time, it's created a situation where you really sometimes don't know who you are talking to and what the truth is.
So would you say?
Attest.
Go ahead.
I can attest to the fact that Facebook was had provided our best leads. People within the area that knew Benji would provide some information that they may have seen her here, or seen something that related to her that might be important, and I can pass that on to the detectives, and they can follow up, in terms of leads, and so it was probably our best way to advertise her missing her situation.
So would you all say, and you may have different perspectives, but would you all say on the whole it's more helpful than it is harmful?
Social media, you mean?
Yeah, as it relates to this topic, because I know we could broaden that to.
Yes, I would say it's more helpful. It's definitely more time consuming for me, but very helpful.
Well, to the extent that you can weed out the fake information that may pop up from time to time, I think I think it still has benefit than it does
yes,
hindrances.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen instances where Facebook became a platform for absolute, or social media in general allowed people to mobilize across border lines, right? I mean, because you're in one state, someone else is in another state, or maybe you thought they were in another state. And social media allows us to cross these lines and access each other and receive support for the most part.
So one of the things that I'm curious, in knowing about, as it relates to this conversation is, we've all referred to kind of the missing white woman syndrome. We know that came from Gwen Ifill. And I know, Renata, you might need to hold me true to this. That was from the 90s, right? Maybe.
I don't recall.
Maybe it was early 2000s. But we're talking like it's been 20 plus years ago. Let's say that. And so in the heat of all this Gabby Petito stuff, I know how the conversation as I was privy to, as it relates to people's frustrations, and whose voices are left out and whose lives are not represented in the media. And I feel like I saw just like brief moments where the media tried to like kind of check the box. So they'd talk about the Gabby Petito story, and then they'd say, oh yeah, and we're under, not we, but like they say, it's being talked about how there's lack of representation. And so they might sprinkle in a quick little story about a person of color. For a while there, I kept seeing those stories about the 3 missing Black men in Arizona. So I guess wherever, and it was like, okay, we'll just pop that in there real quick. And then we'll do another hour, Gabby Petito. Or we'll sprinkle in this one other story over here, right? So it's almost like this check the box type of approach is what I'll call it. How is it that it's 20 plus years after this phrase has kind of been coined, that we're still dealing with this when it's clear, at least on my exposure, that people have an appetite for hearing other people's perspectives? So, like from your vantage point, why are we still in this situation where there's disparate coverage? Anybody can jump in.
Okay. I think change takes time, in terms of demographic, the demographic makeup of our country is changing. And I just talked to someone today who remembers helping integrate schools. People who helped integrate are still alive, and we're slowly making steps toward being able to have uncomfortable conversations. We're in the South. There's a history, there's a legacy across this country of really painful topics, of painful situations of people going missing, Black people going missing. I mean, we're still trying to solve cases from the 30s and 40s.
Cases that we actually know who are responsible for it. That's what I would say. I mean, there were some practices that were pretty common in the South, if you want to talk about the South, where it was, we know that people were lynched in front of audiences of people and people weren't held accountable for it. And we know people were disappeared and people weren't held accountable for it as a matter of practice, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead. I think for like what you just talked about, we're still fighting to get where we want to be. But I mean, realistically, if you think about how Black people are valued in America in general, it's not a surprise that the media is not covering us as much as they would our white counterparts. We're still fighting for importance in general, let alone, for us to be portrayed in the media as that. So I think that goes to, I think that's relevant to say we're still fighting for America to value us as human beings still, and then that I think that plays a part in how important are you for me to put you in the media and get national coverage. Right.
Renata, I think I chimed in and kind of cut you off as you were sorry, I got excited.
No, my statement was pretty much made. So, yeah, I think sometimes people don't want to speak too. Sometimes people see things they don't want to speak about what they saw, about what they know. Mm-hmm. And that's a real difficult thing for law enforcement and journalists, to get people to speak, even loved ones, within families.
Yeah. So if there's and I've watched through the years, I'll reference here in the Quad Cities for the folks who were here at that time. Renata, I'm not sure what time period you were in the Quad Cities, but I've seen coverage for Trudy Appleby since I was 11 years old. Mm-hmm. Do you recall Trudy Appleby, Renata?
I do not. No, I don't know if I was in the Quad Cities at that time.
They've been talking about her for 25 plus years, off and on. So
still talking about her.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
still.
And I believe in it. I don't even know if it's a cold case. I think it's still very active. But
it's very active.
Okay, it is. So I think the other thing, and I see how they cover that. I see we recently had Breasia. Was it Taylor? Terrell.
Terrell.
Breasia Terrell, who was missing and got substantial local coverage. I mean, there was truly, I was proud of the way the community rallied around finding our baby girl.
Breasia had national coverage.
Yep.
I heard about it down here.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think there are things that happen at the local level that I think are applaudable, right? Like I don't want to make it sound as though there aren't people boots on the ground doing the important work that needs to be done. And that includes law enforcement as well. Like I saw what our law enforcement did to rally behind this family and behind this little girl. And I'm sure if I racked my brain, I could point to other examples of that. How does the local level influence the national level, right? Like how does something make it to the Associated Press? How does something make it to where if everybody locally is covering it, why is it not now spreading? And it seems like it's vice versa, like it's national and then local people cover it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what the national outlets, a lot of times what they do is they amplify a story that's local. And so how a story gets chosen, I mean, first of all, it's published at the local level or it airs at the local level. And then sometimes you have these networks where you could, submit the story to be considered or it's picked up nationally. And that's a determination oftentimes of the editor that's, within the mainstream outlet. And sometimes it's a relationship between the local and the national that allows for local stories to become national.
Okay. It just seems like it's hard for me to wrap my mind around how people pick and choose. And we know that there's these disparities and we just keep still picking and choosing these disparities even when things are being called out. And so I hope that through this case that is currently getting national coverage, through these types of conversations, through social media, and then also circling back to what Mr. Tyson said about systemic racism, like we have to have people that actually believe that that's a thing in order to affect change. Another phrase that I want to invite into this conversation is bias, and that takes many forms, right? Whether it's affinity bias, we like people who look like us or who remind us of someone we know or those types of things. But bias definitely plays a role in this too. So even if you don't have an appetite for the conversation around systemic racism, there's even like if something that's more palatable for folks who are decision makers is this conversation around bias, that just can't be denied, right? But I'm hopeful that it's conversations like this can have some level of influence. I think the other thing that's missing from part of this conversation, and I'll try to kind of wrap us here and end on maybe a solution-oriented type of approach, is we hear the story of the missing person. And depending on what information is shared, we get a little information about their background. I hear things that sometimes especially as we look at women, there's domestic violence or assault involved. Perhaps there's volatile relationships, potentially substance abuse. Like we know that right now, people of color are more likely to go missing. And that's the real story. That's actually like the epidemic in all of this. If Black folks only make up 13% of the population and 34% of the missing people, if you want to sensationalize something, there's something there, right? But I guess what I want to know is, what are the conversations? What are the root causes? And what are the conversations that we need to be having at the local level or in our homes to prevent our babies from going missing or our adults from disappearing? And before I turn it over to you all to kind of give me your thoughts and feedback on that, I just want to start by saying, I think my dad was trying to do that when he was telling me to come in before the street lights come on. And, it was more like this whole, like the boogeyman out there. when oftentimes it's a little bit closer to home. So what would you say to parents, to community members who want to have an impact on this phenomenon of us being missing more disproportionately? I'll start with you, Sharmaine. Is that okay?
I'm still thinking about that. That's a tough question, because you just spoke about how your dad is basically teaching you preventative measures and safety measures on how not to go missing, or to prevent something like your cousin prevent something like that from happening. I think, I don't know, everything that he was doing, we should all be doing, but a lot of times we're preventing ourselves from being snatched or missing from strangers, when a lot of times, like you said, it hits close to home. So how do we protect ourselves from people that we trust? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it partly relates. It stems around education. We're having a battle right now for critical race theory in schools, and I think it's important that people understand the impact that the systemic issues that are pervasive in our society today. Critical race theory helps people understand that. A lot of people are scared of that because they don't want to see the truth about their history. But if we can get over those barriers and start teaching people about what impact that's had, and that it still has in our society, within our school systems, on the job, everywhere. I think that would help I think it will translate into greater attention to missing persons. And, we just got to keep fighting that battle to educate people on on our history, basically. I think that's one approach that we could address it at.
Renata, what are some of your thoughts? I think you're muted.
Have a voice, use your voice. And I was just thinking, it's a powerful question that you just asked, and I think it's worth many, many conversations with many people about what they think. And I agree about, this need to create community and create safe spaces for people to talk about things that are not comfortable sometimes. Where are these safe spaces? I think now more than ever, people are fighting to create those. This conversation feels safe, and I'm so happy that we're having it. And I just send so many well wishes and good thoughts, and just hope for the best. And, for your daughter, Mr. Tyson, I really hope that this can, and as well as your first cousin, LaDrina, that this can really amplify their story as well as others.
Can I ask Mr. Tyson a question before we end? So going forward, what are your efforts moving forward? Like Renata talked about campaigning on social media, different things that you can do to expose this issue. What are you going to do moving forward? I mean, differently than you've done in the past, to help this gain some more attention?
Well, I guess that's a good question. I guess maybe getting on podcasts like this, for example, helps raise the awareness, brings her story back to light, may generate some interest, may generate somebody checking and maybe doing some extra efforts to look for her or make contacts with people that that they know of that happen to live in the area that she was last seen in. Things like that. I mean, we still stay in contact with the detectives, and there is an ongoing investigation with her traveling partner. And I'm not at liberty to say what they're going to do at this point, but There, we're at a point where we're trying to make him accountable. We're trying to hold him accountable for her disappearance. So I guess participating in venues like this might maybe drum up some more interest in helping me to find her, helping us to find her.
Yeah. I think about, what you've shared today, Mr. Tyson. I think about what are some of those conversations, and Renata, what rings true for me, and Sharmaine, you as well, right? Like, we're mothers of daughters. And I have 4 daughters, and I tried to think as I prepared that question, what are some things what are conversations either that I need to have or that I've already had? And a couple of things that come to mind for me is all too often women, but particularly Black women, we suffer in silence. And some of our suffering may come in the form of shame because we have to look like we have it all together. And I know in my case, I watched my mom, even though my dad was in and out, she was largely a single parent. But I watched my mom suffer in silence and hold her head high with so much dignity. And when I think about that, my mom is the type of person who probably could have gone missing because she didn't have a safe space where she had somebody who knew what was really going on behind the scenes. She held a lot in, right? And I want to first make sure that I create that space for my daughters, where that if something is going on in a domestic partnership or relationship that just doesn't quite seem right, that they feel like they can let me know, so that especially if it's an intimate relationship, sometimes love can make us blind to those red flags, but at least I'm paying attention to the flags, even if you are love blind, right? And so I hope to create that for my girls. One of the things I always had as a kind of the girl code was leave with who you came with. So if you want to leave and you want to go off and do your thing, then I guess we're leaving. I'm going with, or you coming with me, right? Like, leave with who you came with if you're going out. Some of the other things that I think through are kind of important conversations that my dad did have with me about just kind of being aware of your surroundings, having a little bit of street smarts about you, right? And so I think now that I'm in the position of parenting, it's finding those right moments to have those conversations with your kids before they end up in a situation. And it seems easier said than done, because sometimes it's like, I don't want to introduce a concept to my girls if they're not ready to deal with it, but I also don't want to be reactionary. Like, I want to be a proactive parent. And as I thought through, like, what are those things that I would want to see as pointers or tips to help my daughters be safe, I realized that I didn't have an inkling of what I would be saying to men in this conversation. And so as I think through that, knowing that I'm a mother of daughters, I think the other side of this is, how are we educating? And I'll go back to the Gabby Petito case. How do we educate men or people in domestic partnerships on how to deal with frustration, anger, rage, emotions? So we need to be having some conversations on both sides about, what does it mean to be in relationship with people, right? And I think the data would suggest that, especially in the Black community, that's a really important conversation to have about self-care, self-awareness, and how you show up amongst other people. And I don't want to, Sharmaine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to imply that every single a Black person is missing at the hands of a domestic partner or the hands of another Black person, because certainly that's not the case. But we do know oftentimes the contact is across your own racial lines, right?
Yes.
And so I just think about how we care for each other and knowing when the right time to walk away is in certain situations, whether it means walk away from the relationship or walk away from that heated moment. is probably a conversation that needs to be had with men, women, and every gender in between, right? Because I know there's some things that happen in same-sex relationships in terms of disproportionate domestic violence that's either underreported or not investigated and that type of thing. So I just think there's some important conversations around community, how we care for one another, how we value each other, that needs to happen, not just for girls to be safe, although we talk about this in the context of Black identity and tending to be more prevalent to show women as missing. But I think we need to educate really just the whole Black community on how to show up for each other. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your expertise. Mr. Tyson, I want to just double back and say that I know that this is an emotional labor for you. And so I appreciate you allowing us to share space with you. My thoughts and prayers, and not in just the traditional context of how people throw that out there. I truly will be on my knees tonight for you, for Miss Rexy, for your family, and for your daughter in particular. Thank you so much for giving of your time. To our listeners, I hope you gleaned something from this conversation. Thank you for being with us again, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you for joining us this evening for Hidden Conversations. The Hidden Conversations project is coordinated by Dr. LaDrina Wilson, Tracy Singleton, Dr. Lauren Hammond Ford, Ryan Sadler, and me, Jared Johnson. We would also like to thank everyone on the Intelligent Conversations Planning Committee and on WVIK's Community Advisory Board for their support and guidance. Support for tonight's conversation comes from a Healing Illinois grant from the Chicago Community Trust, as well as a United for Equity grant from United Way Quad Cities. And mark your calendars for March 10th, 2022, when Michelle Norris, longtime host of NPR's All Things Considered, Washington Post contributor, and author of The Grace of Silence, will keynote our live Intelligent Conversation event, made possible by the Joyce and Tony Singh Family Foundation.